first presenter, Saqib Khan, to come forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. My name is Saqib Khan. I'm a PhD student at UBC Okanagan with Dr. Shari Allen. I'm also the branch manager for McElhaney for Bridges. Dr. Allen is my supervisor. He's the associate professor at UBC Okanagan. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the effects of main shock, aftershock sequences as they relate to bridges. I'll preface this with a couple of things, because it's a state-of-the-art review, and I had to look at a lot of papers and distill it down. It doesn't carry a lot of detail. I've just tried to stay at a very high level because I only have 15 minutes. So if you are so interested as to look deeply into this, please refer to the paper, and even that will only scratch the surface because I only had 8 pages. So you really need to go and read more of the papers that are in the reference section. And the other thing is, because of copyright issues, I was not able to put very many figures. So in a way, this is going to be death by PowerPoint, but I've tried to make it as simple as possible. So stay with me. I think I'll touch upon a few things. So starting here, I think the one thing we all realize is several past earthquakes have had big aftershocks. I think if you were in the keynote, you would have heard about Christchurch and how many aftershocks there were, and it was actually the 6.3 that happened later that brought about a lot of the damage. What happens with most of our seismic codes is they simply ignore the effects of aftershocks, and what we're really doing is designing considering a single peak engineering demand parameter such as spectral acceleration. So that's a bit of a shortcoming. However, what's happened is our analytical tools have advanced. Owners now want to know how their structure is going to behave under a single event or multiple events. We do have the performance-based design methodology, which lends itself quite nicely to be able to come up with the performance of a structure, whether it's a single earthquake or multiple earthquakes. So we've had unsatisfactory performance in the large earthquakes in the past. S614, which is the current Canadian code, does give us a little bit of a flavor as to what it requires for aftershock performance. It basically wants us to retain 90% of the capacity of the structure for limited service and repair or damage performance levels, and 80% for service disruption and extensive damage performance levels. So these requirements are in addition to the material strains for each performance. The problem is the term seismic capacity is quite ambiguous. Are we talking about force capacity? Are we talking about displacement capacity? A reduction in strength? A reduction in stiffness? What is it that we're trying to retain 90% of or 80% of? That's a bit tricky. So we authored a document for the engineers and geoscientists of British Columbia, which is best practice for doing performance-based design in BC. It's been adopted, and this is one of the possible interpretations that we came up with as part of that. And because I was involved in this work, so I have this picture. So it's basically looking at a notional pushover analysis, accounting for strength degradation, and you basically have a drop off in your force demand, and you can map your displacement on there and see where that displacement occurs when you have 90% of the capacity left or 80% of the capacity left. So that in essence becomes your displacement capacity for each one of those performance points. So that's going to be in addition to whatever displacement capacities you get corresponding to the strain values that are in the code. And either those or these points will govern depending on whichever occurs first. So the whole idea here, even though these seem arbitrary, was to basically have some way of keeping some capacity in your system. You don't want to push it so far that an aftershock comes along and the thing goes boom. So the whole idea is to retain some capacity. However, it's ambiguous. We then looked at the S614 supplement for the Ministry of Transportation. I was involved with that a little bit, and we decided to get rid of that whole thing, simply because there are no agreed upon methodologies at this point. And we need some comprehensive studies or modern detailing testing to come up with some recipes, some ideas as to how to do this. If you look at a lot of the studies that have happened in the past, they're based on incremental dynamic analysis, which ties to the spectral acceleration at the first period of your structure. But if you look at this is predicting the performance. This is like a dynamic pushover analysis. So you have 30 suites that are scaled to the same spectral acceleration. That's why you see at a ductility of 1, they're all the same. But as you keep scaling them up, you get a very wide range of performance. So things have been tied to the spectral acceleration, and it seems with this sort of a spread that it may not be the best engineering demand parameter. There may be other parameters that one might want to look at. So what happens when we look at the seismic performance quantification is you need to look at two broad categories: the ground motion features, which is the seismicity side, and the structural system, so the structural design and detail. And we need to consider these sort of factors: the seismic sources, the ground period and duration, direction and polarity of your earthquake and your aftershocks. And then, of course, the structural strength and ductility, which is also tied very closely to the hysteretic behavior that a structure might possess. So I'm going to go through these one by one and just give you a very high-level flavor of what I've seen is out there. And I will also say at this point that most of the studies are building-based. There are very, very few at this point that are bridge-based. So this study by Tesfamarian and Goda, they found that the structural collapse potential varies significantly from different sources. And we know that we have 3 different sources, at least in British Columbia. We've got the crustal, the subcrustal or in-slab, and also the subduction earthquakes. And I think Dr. Ventura is going to talk about that tomorrow. So the longer period structures were found to have little impact from aftershocks. And I will say that this was a limited study. It looked at 2, 4, 8, and 12-story non-ductile frames. So please don't think of this as an end-all, be-all. This is just one data point. The crustal and end-slab events, they produce diminishing performance differences. So as you put in aftershocks, you didn't see much of a difference for the longer period events for these type of sources. The shorter period, the 2-story buildings were showing worsening of performance. Rui Garcia, they analyzed several main shock aftershock sequences. That was including Christchurch and lots of recorded time histories from NGA West, as well as the Mexican database of strong motions. Predominant ground period, which is really an indication of the frequency content of the earthquake, was found to be consistently longer for main shocks, which means that the aftershock ground motions are way more rich in high frequencies than main shocks. So that was a big takeaway. And he also found weak statistical correlation between strong motion duration of main shocks and aftershocks. Now you see a lot of studies just use the main shock as the aftershock. So you're just running the big event with the same frequency content, with the same duration, and a lot of people just use that. And this was basically showing that's probably not the best way to go, to just repeat the main shock as the aftershock. We can do better than that. We also found that bridge columns that are subjected to long duration motions, they tend to have significantly reduced displacement capacities. There are studies that have seen that when you subject a column to a high duration event versus a low duration event, your ultimate displacement capacities may reduce by as much as 25%. And also, if you look at spectral accelerations that collapse, they were found to be significantly lower. There's a study by Wu and others, and they found similar peak strength, but much lower ductility capacity. So they took 2 different columns, a baseline column with shorter duration protocol, and tested a longer duration protocol, and found that the peak strength was similar, but then your ductility reduced quite a bit. And again, similar hysteretic envelope was obtained, up to about 3% drift, but the stiffness degradation was also lower. So everything is pointing to the fact that aftershocks do have a worsening effect. So Billa and Dr. Allen, I think, and others, they investigated the effects of long duration and near fall motions. Used the IDA. This particular example had about 0.48 seconds for the period. And again, they found a lower collapse margin for long duration motions compared to the near fall. And again, this is one study. I don't want the audience to think that these are, you can't make generalizations out of these. These are data points that make us wiser and bring us more knowledge, but this is not covering the whole range of things. So if you were to do the same thing with different periods and different time histories with different frequency content, you will probably find different conclusions. So we know that the frequency content is different, and so therefore there may be situations when the aftershocks are rich in frequency bands that match with the damaged structural period, and then you can have a lot more damage in aftershocks. So we need to do more investigations there. The other thing is the main shock direction and the aftershock polarity. So polarity is really just an inherent bias. So if you have an irregular structure and you have an earthquake that happens and it ratchets and goes in a certain direction, now the aftershock comes along and it has a bias of pushing it in the same direction, now you're going to get more damage. Something that has the opposite polarity has been seen to recenter your bridge, your structure. So it could go either way. The takeaway is that you need to be aware of polarity as well. Of course, the modern ductile frames, they are able to undergo higher levels of damage before the aftershock collapse capacity kicks in. The issue with non-ductile frames is not just flexure deficiencies, they have axial and shear deficiencies, so those become quite important. And the reduction in collapse capacity as a function of main shock damage is more precipitous. You get there faster for non-ductile reinforced concrete frames, so be mindful of that. The order, the badly detailed columns for bridges, they're at much more risk. We've seen decrease or increase in peak ductility demands for single degree freedom systems, which means that if you have less ductility capacity, you're going to run into issues with aftershocks kicking in. Hysteretic behavior, it's really indicated the strength degradation to be related to maximum displacement and energy dissipation. Okay, so this was a study again, done by Wu and others. So when you look at the hysteretic behavior, strength degradation really relates to how far you're pushing your system and how much energy it's able to dissipate. Stiffness degradation is also found to be related to energy dissipation, but pinching behavior is a function more of the maximum displacement. And that again is on high shear columns, that's where pinching kicks in. And what was found was that when drift exceeded 3%, the long duration loading columns versus a shorter duration protocol or earthquake, they showed a greater strength degradation. So in this study, they did some experimental evaluation, and they came up with a new hysteretic model to basically predict the behavior. And then a comparison was made between that model and the modified Clough model. And it was shown that if you use two different hysteretic models, you were getting differences of up to 10 to 20% depending upon whether you had short period motions or long period motions. Okay, so just keep that in mind, that when we're modeling these structures, modeling our plastic hinges, the hysteretic model that we use is quite important, because 20% is quite a significant difference. Rui Garcia, in a different study, employed about 28 main shock aftershock seismic sequences, and he used these from the Mexican Pacific Coast Subduction Zone. Really, these were used to look at the low-height highway bridges in Mexico. They didn't experience significant lateral peak and residual drift demands when they were using the as-recorded earthquakes, because the spectral accelerations and the demands were on the low side. However, what they did was they incremented the demand, they basically scaled it up just to see how the system would respond. And it was found that the increment of peak and residual drift demands was dependent on the type of hysteretic behavior considered and the level of ground motion intensity. So as you ratcheted it up, you got worsening of the performance. In this study, basically used the Takeda model with no degradation, and then the Takeda model with moderate and severe degradation, and found different results. So again, that kind of shows us that it's quite important. This is just one thing I did dare take from the paper. It's just showing some main shock aftershock sequences. There are now large databases that you can go and pick out a lot of the main shock aftershock sequences, the KNet and the KKNet from Japan, the NGA West. You have lots of sources if you want to look into some of this stuff. Towards the end, I want to talk again, just go back to this whole capacity reduction consideration issue. It's a simple way to see how resilient your bridges are to aftershocks and to determine the reduction in capacity of the structure. Again, there is an ambiguity. There are different engineering demand parameters that one could use. So Espinosa, he did his master's, and this comes from his master's work. He used three different ones. Basically, the ultimate force, the stiffness, and strain energy ratios to quantify capacity reduction. One could use other engineering demand parameters. There's lots of them out there. So this used a probabilistic seismic demand model framework, and eventually produced some 3D surface plots comparing the capacity ratio reduction. It was really conditioned on the peak ground velocity, and basically produced for both the main shock and the main shock aftershock sequences. So you see how things are changing when you're looking at just the main shock versus the main shock and the aftershock. And through this, some dispersion values were obtained, and the lesser dispersion is, you can think of the engineering demand parameter to be more stable and more robust, and therefore perhaps more reliable. So the best correlation in this study was found to be strain energy. So if you were to do a pushover analysis and you have a force displacement curve, it's really the energy, it's the area under the graph, which is your strain energy. It's a measure of your capacity. So you run a pushover for the virgin bridge, and then you run the pushover for a bridge that's been damaged, and then you do some nonlinear time history analysis to look at your demands, and you can correlate them. The least well-behaved parameter was the ultimate force, and that tells us that it's not such a good thing to do. Forces, we know, are not a good indication when it comes to seismic design. Displacements and energy are a lot better. Okay, so considering all EDPs though, aftershocks showed worsening of demand. I'll just conclude very simply here. I've basically said that most seismic hosts are simply end up ignoring the effects of aftershocks, which is perhaps not the best thing. S614 has incorporated some simple stuff, but it's ambiguous. It's been made a bit more ambiguous to my mind in S619, I think, only because it's still there, but the 80%, 90% has been taken out. In a way, it's better, because it's not prescriptive, so we have to think about it. Several studies have looked at different seismic and structural variables, and almost all of them have confirmed worsening of performance when we look at aftershocks. We do have some knowledge about the different parameters and how they affect bridge performance. However, there is a need to unify the approaches and carry out a comprehensive study or set of studies that look at the effects of different variables in a holistic manner. Because we've looked at different things, but nobody's really combined things together to come up with a workable framework. It's great that most of these studies have used nonlinear time history analysis, and that sort of rigor is needed because this is a complicated issue. We need to do that. However, if we need to advance the state of practice, we have to realize that some of this stuff, once it's all done in a lot of depth, somebody has to come up with simplified procedures to perhaps then get into those things into the code, and they have to be simplified enough that they can be used in the design.